you're still there. Let me take off my glasses here. I took a little bit of an interlude. Hope you don't mind. It's dark now, but maybe the board is easier to see. I'm not super sure. So if you remember, we stopped on step 5, which I broke down into 3 steps, 5A, B, and C. And the reason I did that is it makes it a little bit easier because they kind of go together, but they're all a little separate. So if you've determined after going through step 5 that the contract is enforceable, statute of frauds doesn't bar it, and you determine what kind of terms are going to be a part of that deal, and whether, if it's between merchants, additional terms will be potentially added into there, essentially modifying the contract with an additional writing. Went over all that already. So the next thing we're really going to look at is, once you've determined, say for example, we're going to say for the bulk of this that we're talking a merchant-to-merchant transaction, okay? In a merchant-to-merchant transaction, the buyer has a lot of rights about whether they want to accept a delivery of something that they had purchased. So why is it important to consider the type of delivery and the type of contract regarding the purchase and the delivery of something? The reason is simply because the rights of a buyer actually change and the rights of the seller actually change depending on the type of contract that we're discussing. That's a very nuanced introduction. I apologize. It gets easier. So if we have a baker that deals with a caterer, and they often buy cupcakes from this caterer, what happens in this situation is we have all these people constantly buying cupcakes, and say they buy cupcakes every month, 6 months out of the year, and they had just contracted to buy cupcakes from January to June. Now, if these people deliver, the sellers deliver cupcakes to the buyer every single month for 6 months, this is what we would call an installment contract. Now, an installment contract can be one of many things. It could be just like the example I said, where they have a contract for something that's going to be delivered in multiple deliveries over the course of a period of time. Now, that literally could be broken up into multiple single contractual obligations and transactions if you think about it. But typically, for the purposes of Article 2, we're going to say that's an installment contract because when you add them all together, it forms one gigantic contract for all of these things. Now, most of the time, installment contracts are for the bulk of an entire thing that gets broken up into sections. So usually, if I say, as say a clothing store, I want to buy a bunch of clothes from a designer, I'm going to request these clothes from a designer, and say the designer can't fulfill the order in one big delivery, they can do so in 5 deliveries. So let's say I ordered 2 million shirts, and they have to break that down into 5 deliveries. So they're going to have 400, right? Yeah, 400,000, 400,000, 400,000, 400,000, 400,000 shirts in every delivery. So we have 400,000 times 5 equals 2 million, right? Every single 400,000 that's delivered is not going to be considered a single contract because it's one part of a whole. It's considered an installment contract. The reason that it's important to determine whether you have an installment contract or a single contract is it drastically changes step 7 and step 8, okay? So if it's an installment contract, think of it like you can't just take that one small part of that transaction and say that it's all by itself because there's more to the contract. Usually, if you have an installment contract, one delivery is just one part of an entire contract, and when you take that part away, it usually doesn't make sense, or you can tell that it's one small part of something larger. So when you look at an installment contract, usually it's a large contract broken up into pieces, okay? Now, a single contract is very easy to distinguish, so I'm not going to spend that much time on it. A single contract is really just a contract for one thing. I would like to buy a car off of Carvana, and they're going to deliver it to my home. That's a single contract. single time contract because there's only one transaction. There's going to be one delivery and one acceptance from the buyer to the seller. There's only really one interaction, if you will. Because it's only one interaction, step 7 and 8 are going to be drastically different if it's just one time we're interacting with each other. Now, in an installment contract, you're going to be interacting a lot, sometimes over the course of many weeks, months, and maybe even years, depending on the terms of the contract. So, understanding if it's a single time contract or an installment contract is very important. Now, there might be some facts that might confuse you, like there's a single time delivery only one time, but there's payments throughout 6 months. The purpose of determining what kind of contract it is specific to the delivery of the product itself. So, if the product itself was delivered one time and there's no more scheduled deliveries, then it's going to be a single time contract, regardless if you still have payments or not. Now, if you have payments but you have multiple deliveries, then it's going to be an installment contract. Usually the facts are pretty easy to differentiate. If there's lots of deliveries, there's going to be a lot of communication, it's going to be an installment contract. If there's not, if there's just a one time, then it's a single contract. Now, there are some rules that say that you can kind of break a contract in half and figure it out from there. For the purposes of UCC Article 2, we don't have to do that, so don't worry. That would actually be something that might happen more in basic UCC contracts land, or not UCC contracts, I apologize, common law contracts land. But we're not in contracts land, basically. We're in a little bit more advanced UCC Article 2. So, for the purposes of step 6, what kind of contract do I have? A service contract, or, I apologize, an installment contract, or do I have a single contract? If I have a single transaction contract, step 7 and 8 are going to be a little bit different. If I have an installment contract, it's going to be different. Now, just for your purposes, I want you to remember that a single time contract has higher standards that have to be upheld, where an installment contract does not. And we're going to get into that when we get to step 7. So, don't hear any questions, I guess we're going to continue to step 7. So, a single contract requires what is known as the perfect tender rule. Now, what that means is, if I'm only contracting for one item to be bought and delivered, that item has to be fulfilled perfectly based on what I ordered. For example, if I order a car off of Carvana and I order a souped up Ford 250 all-terrain tires, SIT, right? E-Class, okay? If I order this truck and they deliver me a truck that is souped up, 4-wheel drive Ford 250 truck with all-wheel tires or all-terrain tires, however, they don't have E-Class tires, they have a different class, I can say that that fulfillment of that order that I, the buyer, gave to you, seller, fails the perfect tender rule because the product that I ordered was not given to me exactly as I ordered it. If it does not match the order itself perfectly, it fails the perfect tender rule. Now, we're going to get into what that means in a little bit, but just know the perfect tender rule only applies to a single transaction contract. You're like, why do I have to figure out what kind of contract it is to figure out these rules? Because perfect tender rule only applies to a single time transaction. So it's very important that you do this part first, because if you do number 6 first, you're going to automatically know what step 7 is. So step 7 and step 8 kind of play off of step 6. So if you skip step 6, you're going to actually do a lot more analysis and work that you wouldn't need to do. So when you get to step 7, you know it's a single contract, single transaction contract, you're going to say, because it's a single contract, a single transaction contract, we know because there's going to be only one interaction, blah, 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 we are going to apply the perfect tender rule. And then you analogize the order that was given by the buyer, and you compare it to what the seller fulfilled. If what the seller fulfilled does not match perfectly, then the perfect tender rule would allow a buyer to have other remedies, which we're going to get into later, but pretty much just know if an order fails perfect tender because the seller does not perfectly tender this item exactly as ordered, the buyer has every right to say, no, sorry, I don't want it. Okay, so that's why single transactions, you have a lot more power as a buyer because it has to be absolutely perfect. Now, you're like, okay, I got it. But what if it is an installment contract? If it's an installment contract, then you are typically almost always going to be looking towards what's called the right to cure rule. Now, an installment contract is usually multiple deliveries over the course of some time. Now, what is the right to cure rule? So, although the buyer is supposed to get the benefit of the bargain that they signed up for, you, as a buyer, if you are a part of an installment contract, cannot just say, no, I don't want this because these items aren't perfect, just like that, without giving the seller an opportunity to fix the problem. So what a right to cure is actually a right of the seller. So in step 7, the first one, perfect tender, is the right of a buyer, whereas a right to cure in step 7 is the right of the seller. Now what this right is it says, look here, buyer, I know I did not fulfill the order as ordered, but I have a right to fix the problem that I made as the seller. Now there's a caveat to this rule, and that is that as long as it can be done in a commercially reasonable fashion, and it can be done in a reasonable time frame. What does that mean? That means that if I, the buyer, ordered something, and it's, say, part of an installment contract, and I expect that to be there by the second Tuesday of every single month, and the order is not there by the second Tuesday of that month, say it's there by the first Tuesday of that month, which means that they have a whole other week before technically they're contractually obligated to fulfill my order. If they have a whole extra week, the seller, based on the right to cure, is allowed to take that extra week to fix the problem. Now, if it's an installment contract, and even if it's a single time transaction, if there is a time frame where the seller fulfills their obligation earlier, but they fail to do so perfectly, whether it's an installment contract or single term transaction contract, the buyer has an obligation to give notice to the seller so that they have time to fix the problem. Now, in a single transaction, there is a chance for the seller to fix the problem, and they're allowed to fix the problem, but it's only if there's that window of time frame that's cushioned in. If the seller was obligated to fulfill a transaction by the 15th of the month, and they delivered the wrong product on the 15th of the month, the seller does not have a right to cure because they don't have any time to do so. Now, if the seller delivers the product, say, on the 5th, that gives them 10 days to fix the problem. And in that instance, even in a single transaction delivery, they would be allowed to have the opportunity to cure, to fulfill their obligation under the contract based on what they promised to do. A little bit more nuanced than I thought it was going to be when I started. I apologize. So when it comes to the right to cure, it is a seller's right, and it's usually going to be seen in installment contracts because single deliveries, they're usually not as timely in the sense that they're usually like probably right on time. It's very rare that they're a little bit earlier that gives the seller this right to fix a problem. But I could easily see on an essay you being tested on the nuance of 7, because they probably have an installment contract, right? If they have an installment contract, they're going to say, you know, there's an installment contract and the delivery didn't match the purchase order. What would be the buyer's remedies here? Or what can the buyer do? If you say the buyer has a right to reject the order based on the perfect tender rule, you would be flat wrong. Why? Perfect tender rule only applies to single transactions. Does not apply to installment contracts. Now, if you have a single transaction, another nuance that I've already discussed, they would probably test you on is if it's a single transaction, they might say, it's a single transaction, the seller performed 10 days early, but it was wrong. What rights do you have as a buyer? Well, based on the perfect tender rule, I can flat out reject accepting that product, but the seller has a chance to fix the problem if they can do so by the end of the contract date. And then you would say, and that right is called the right to cure that the seller has. Now, typically, you're going to see the right to cure usually with installment contracts because, again, you're going to use what's known as the trilogy to kind of fill in some information here. And this is where 6 and 7 both become very nuanced. So I'm so sorry. I'm going to touch on it here because it makes the most sense to do so. So if you have a single transaction contract, that's a one-time delivery. We're probably never going to talk again, usually. But what if this is a single contract between merchants that do business together all the time? In that case, although you usually are allowed as a buyer to use what's called the perfect tender rule, because they completely say, absolutely not, I disagree with this product, I refuse to accept it. If you can argue as a seller based on the trilogy that you reasonably believed that the buyer would not have had a problem with how you fulfilled their order, then even if you don't have the extra time built into that contract, you would still be allowed to fix that mistake. And that actually is a nuanced exception and kind of loophole to the right to cure in a single term contract. Now you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't worry, I'll explain it further. So what I mean by that is if you have what's known as course of dealings, because if it's a single term contract, there's not going to be a course of performance because it's typically one and done. There would be a course of dealings because you know this person. If on your course of dealings, they make random single contract purchases all the time, and you have changed the color of that product before, you have changed the style of that product before, you've even changed the quality, and they have, as the buyer, accepted every single time you did not fulfill it exactly as was ordered, and you've been doing this for a few months or maybe even a few years, then as the seller, would I be shocked if they said perfect tender rule, not accepting it? Yes, I'd be shocked. Why? Because based on our communication in the past, based on our workings in the past, based on our course of dealings under the trilogy, you have never had a problem accepting this before. I think it's super weird you have a problem now because I thought you would have accepted based on our past dealings, even though I delivered it on June 15th, and I was supposed to deliver it on June 15th, I will be able to have a right to cure because of the trilogy, not because I have the actual time to do so. So it's almost like you are given extra time based on that trilogy. It's okay. Buckle up. It's going to get easier, I promise. So that's why these rules are very important. And it's important to understand the difference between a single contract and an installment contract, because then you know automatically which rule will apply and which rules can apply. But just like everything in this section, I'm hoping that you're realizing the trilogy can come up to add additional information and context to understand why the parties did what they did, why they contracted the way they did, why they phrased things the way that they did, why they didn't include things in the contract, why they did include things in the contract, why they used really strange innocuous terms that nobody else understands. It's because of the trilogy. The trilogy literally can go into a lot of these things, and just be aware the trilogy can create sometimes nuance things, understandings, and applications. But you're fine. So you're probably wondering, what the hell do I do with this? Well, it's going to be dependent on what it is, okay? But anytime it's a single, the only time a right to cure can ever apply to a single term contract is going to be if there is a course of dealings. Now, you might be able to make an argument for usage of trade, but I find that to be very difficult to argue. But if you wanted to argue that way, you could, and then you could conclude it by saying, although potentially in this usage of trade, people do X, Y, and Z typically, and they're part of this trade, it's very unlikely the court would find this because they've never worked together in the past or something along those lines. And you could easily raise and dismiss if you wanted to. With something like sales, I would really caution you on raising and dismissing things that don't necessarily apply, because there's usually a lot of analysis that is going to need to be done, because if you haven't figured out already, every single step requires analysis. And all the steps that I'm going through are necessary to actually get to your framework the way that you need to handle all these problems. So I apologize for the work. Now, step 7 is not too bad, right? It's going to be easy. Now, step 8, we're looking at inspection and acceptance. So, I, buyer, received the beautiful, amazing Ford 250 that I ordered, okay, all-wheel drive, because as most of you know, I need an all-wheel drive in my life. So, as a buyer, I have an absolute right to inspect the goods that I purchased. Now, why is inspection so important? Well, if I do not have the ability to inspect my goods because the seller prevents me from doing so, they delay me from doing so, or something else, that could actually kind of be indicative of some sort of fraud, and it would allow me to potentially get out of the contract. So that's why step 8 is important, because step 8 can help you either get out of a contract, can help you negate damages from a contract, and potentially can speak to warranties. So number 8 is very important to establish correctly so you know which warranty you're working with, damages calculation you're working with, or anything of that nature. So pay close attention to this one. So as a buyer, I have that absolute right to inspect something before I accept it. Now, there are, factors, rules, sort of loosely regarding inspection. And that's just really, obviously, commercial reasonableness. But really, it's, do I have enough time to look at this item? Now, that's obviously going to be one of those jury questions, if you will, because what does reasonable really mean, right? So if you're looking at, did I have a reasonable amount of time to inspect this? Well, it depends on what it is. If it is specifically an item like a car, I probably could check it over, maybe test drive it on the highway. That might be considered enough. Do I need 6 months to inspect it? No, that's completely unreasonable. Most courts find 6 months too long. Sometimes they might find 3 months to be acceptable, especially if there's something wrong with a product that you order that's innocuous and very strange, and something that you would not typically find. So you have to look at inspection through kind of a nuanced lens, because sometimes it's very straightforward. Like if I buy these glasses, right, and I look through them, I put them on, I mean, that's what they're used for, right? I go out in the sun, do my eyes hurt? Do they block the sun? Do they fit on my nose? That's it, right? There's nothing, it's done. But what about, something like an AC system? And, it's fall. So I'm not really using the AC that much, but I bought it so that I could buy it for, the summer for next year, so I don't have to worry about shortage of supply because I have an Airbnb. And I buy this AC system, and I don't start using it until, say, February. End of February, say I've had it 3 months. And I start to really heavily utilize this product that I didn't really use it before. Is that a reasonable enough time to inspect? The court might arguably say, given the circumstances, it was fall, you didn't really have a time to inspect it. But then another court might say, well, you had 3 months time to figure out if it works or not, you should know by now. So the next thing you're going to look at too is like, okay, if I had a reasonable time to inspect and it's commercially reasonable, 3 months time, commercially reasonable, then you have to think, okay, based on what ended up being wrong with this product that I ordered, is the defect something that I would have had a chance to find in this time frame, given the circumstances, given the situation? And it's a toss-up again, right? There's going to be a toss-up. If the AC was bought in the fall, I would probably argue, if I was arguing it for that person, nope, he had reasonable time to check and inspect. However, because of the time of year, he really wasn't using the product. By the time he did start using the product, he was able to see that the product was in fact effective, and he would not have known had he not used it, which he wouldn't have used it until this time frame. So therefore, it was reasonable for him to find the defect then. And so it's very important to suss this out. So really you just have to look at, did the buyer actually do their due diligence to inspect the stuff that they bought, or use the product to see and try and locate any type of problem within this actual machinery? Or did they have enough time to do all of these things based on the product? So it's really just time. Did they do their due diligence to actually take advantage of the time to inspect? And then sometimes you have to look at the circumstances, and based on that, like, what is the answer here? Most of the time, inspection time, anytime before 3 months, is considered a reasonable time, depending on what it is. For machinery, you usually might have like up to 3 months. You might be able to argue 6 months, but that's a stretch. But the thing is that you're going to notice with inspection is, once you notice or find that there's a problem, or you find a defect, you have to do something about that. If you continue to use a product that's defective and you continue to use it for its intended purpose, even with all these problems, then you lose a lot of credibility as a buyer, because if it was such a problem, why did you keep using it, right? That's one thing to consider. Now, besides inspection, you also have to think about the acceptance. So the purpose of inspection is to determine whether or not I want to accept what I bought. So if I buy a Ford 250 and they deliver it, I take it on the highway a couple times, I check everything, I check all the lights, and I think it's fine. And I accept it based on that inspection. That's fine. I had a reasonable time. It was commercially reasonable. I had a chance to detect anything, and so I accepted the product. Now, the reason acceptance kind of goes hand in hand with inspection is if you did in fact do an inspection and everything turned out well, then if you accept the actual product and then later something is amiss or something you find out is wrong, something that even if you did do your inspection the way that you were supposed to, no person would have found this defect until much later. That might allow you additional contract remedies to get out of this contract. But it depends on if you did in fact do the inspections and what the problem was. Now let's say you don't inspect the product and you just accept it right off the bat. 8 months later you find there's a problem. What are you allowed to do as a buyer? Probably not much. The problem with acceptance is once a buyer accepts a product, they can never reject it. So if they do inspect this product, and I say I got my Ford 250, and it has a problem, it has a defect, it doesn't accelerate at all, I am not going to accept it. I'm going to flat out reject the product. And by just flat out rejecting the product, I protect myself as a buyer because it's no longer really my problem because it's not in my possession because I rejected it. I didn't fulfill my end of the bargain because I found that they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. Now, on the other hand, if I don't do any inspections at all, and then I accept the deal, I can't then say I reject this item that I received 8 months ago that I failed to inspect. And even if I did inspect, once you have accepted a product, you can no longer reject that product. Now, I'm saying that a lot because a professor that we all know and love doesn't like the phrasing that couples acceptance and the very next sentence rejection. So say, for example, in a final exam, you say, the buyer inspected the goods, took the reasonable time to see if there was any defects, and anybody that would have done their due diligence would have or should have found the defect within this amount of time, and they didn't find it, so therefore they accepted the product. However, 6 months later, they found that the product actually had a malfunction that they would not have found except for some time of use, and it's kind of an innocuous defect that even under the best inspection, it would not have been easily found. Therefore, the buyer rejected his offer or his acceptance later. No, there's no such thing as rejecting acceptance. You've already accepted. There's a different word for it, okay? But it's not rejection. We're going to get into what it is. So it's actually called revocation, all right? Once you've accepted something, if you want to take back what you said, you want to take back accepting this, you actually call it a revocation because you're revoking your acceptance. If you are given a product and you do not accept it, that's called a rejection, okay? So just know your terms and use them appropriately because you're going to sound smarter and you're more likely going to get more points because you don't want to confuse the two. So let's go through this really quick. I'm buying a Ford 250 for myself. I've never worked with them before. It is a single transaction contract, which means I, as a buyer, have a right to a perfect tender. If the seller does not provide me a perfect tender of what I ordered, and they do not provide me and furnish what I ordered exactly to the T, I can say, nope, don't want it, and I can flat out reject it. Now, if they do provide a perfect tender of what I ordered exactly, then as a buyer, I'm going to do my due diligence, and I'm going to look at that product. I'm going to inspect that product. I'm going to try to use that product. and I'm going to take a reasonable amount of time inspecting it, and I'm going to ensure that I try to find any potential defects that there could possibly be. I'm going to hire a mechanic and come look at this beautiful 250 for me. He's going to say it's great. Okay. Based on that inspection, I'm going to accept the Carvana delivery of this product that I ordered. Based on that acceptance, it becomes mine, right? Now, if I have already accepted the product and something comes up later, then I will have a few remedies, either on warranty, or I may be able to revoke my offer depending on what's going on. Alternatively, I am a baker and I buy cupcakes from this amazing catering company because I just cannot do cupcakes. I'm just so swamped with the cakes I make. So this amazing catering company on the side, they do cupcakes, and they decide to deliver cupcakes to me based on our transaction that we have contracted for. This transaction orders 600 cupcakes within the first half of the year to be split up based on the caterer's ability to fulfill. Very broad, very vague, don't recommend, but let's say that's what it is. Now let's say I've been working with this caterer for 2 decades, okay? And they have given me strawberry cupcakes, carrot cake, red velvet, vanilla, whatever they're in the mood for, they make. And they bring me 10 cupcakes the month of January, 50 cupcakes the month of February, and say that they bring 40 cupcakes the month of March. And then, in the month of April, they bring 400. And then the month of May, they only bring 3. Now, in the month of May, I, the buyer, am like, I reject your offer because I, based on our course of dealings, have come to presume that you will always furnish at the very least 10 cupcakes in delivery. This is only 3, therefore I reject. Now, the seller in this case would be able to say, okay, well, you can't flat out just reject it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix this and bring 7 more because I have the ability to do so in our contract and based on working together. Additionally, I assume that you wouldn't have a problem with it. So this is kind of a play on the right to cure plus the trilogy a little bit. Now, let's take it a different step, okay? Let's say it's a single contract, single transaction, but with somebody you've worked with a long time. It's a single contract, somebody you've worked with a long time. You're gonna say, I don't want these cupcakes because they don't fit the order I ordered to the T. As the seller, you're gonna say, I would like to fix that because I, first of all, delivered it early, and even if I hadn't delivered it early, I still could fix it because we worked together for years, and I believed as the seller, now this is the important part, I believed as the seller that it would not be a problem. If you truly believe the seller would not be a problem, then you have the right to cure whether you have time or not. Now, when you come to the inspection and acceptance, you might say, I inspect these cupcakes, they look fine, I accept them, but then the cupcakes end up causing food poisoning and everybody gets sick and they're in the hospital and they sue you. You can then go and sue the caterer, and you can sue on revocation of the acceptance, even though this is a good that's obviously perishable, you can still sue, and it's not going to be a rejection, remember, because you already accepted, but you could sue based on a revocation of acceptance, and you could probably sue under some type of warranty. So those are those steps. Don't hear any questions. Little nuancy, talked probably a little fast because I get a little excited. However, you can slow me down if I'm talking too fast. Isn't the computer's amazing? So I think that's it for these. Now we're going to get to actually revocation and rejection. And the reason those are important is because that kind of goes into breach. So we're probably going to have a couple more layered steps, if you will. So stay tuned.